Right, first question I learned from my father who used to lecture at QIT. Can you hear me? Great. Yeah. Well, look, thank you to AAAA, the Honourable Paul Lucas, Graham, Deb, others who've been involved in this. It's a pleasure to be back in my home city of Brisbane as the poster boy for UQ and proof you can do an arts degree and earn a living. And I'm really very happy to be able to share with you what I will freely state at the outset are my perspectives and takeouts from 40 years studying Russian language, politics, history, culture, the country. I first visited the Soviet Union as a language student attending a Russian language summer seminar course in 1985. I joined the Department of Foreign Affairs for lack of a credible alternative. And I have not really had any reason to doubt that choice. And I've been delighted that I've been able to use my combined honours degree in German and Russian in roles in Germany, in the Soviet Union. When I went back as ambassador, I was asked had I been there before, and I used to say, well, it's my second time in Moscow, but my first time in Russia. And people got that. So what I want to try to do today, and with apologies on behalf of Dr. Matt Sussex, whose father, Rolly Sussex, is a significant figure in University of Queensland. Matt unfortunately succumbed to an illness that his son brought back from a holiday in Tasmania, and he's sounding pretty awful at home in Canberra. So I'm going to do my best to give you one for the price of two this evening. But I do want to say, there may be a poll afterwards. Is it a Putin or is it a Russia problem? And my starting point is that I am a Russophile, but I am a Kremlinophobe. And the Kremlin is very adroit at presenting any criticism of policies of the Russian government as Russophobia, which is bollocks. So when Frau Magda Zakharova, as I like to call her, sprouts this Russophobic Western view, it's not true. But I do think we have a right to hold Russia to account, the government of Russia to account for its policies and its actions. And I'm going to just take you through my sense of some of the abiding elements that from Russian history continue to shape the way in which Moscow views the world, and why that matters to us, and why Russia matters to us here in the Antipodes. Keep an eye on this image in the left. We'll come back to it. While that slide is frozen, I want to touch on, as I was indicating, some of the things that I think are integral to what I would call eternal Russia. I want to look at what I think Russia wants. I want to touch on some of the warnings and lessons from Putin's war of choice in Ukraine. And then I want to get to the sort of so what, now what part of this presentation. Why does it matter to Australia? What do we need to be doing about it? I would submit that there are four elements that we can see repeat throughout Russian history, and they are authoritarianism, spiritualism, exceptionalism, and Russia's perception of its lived experience of what I might call convulsion, unrest, upheaval, disorder, challenges to the established order. And since the emergence in the late 16th century of what we would recognise nowadays largely as the geography of the core of the Russian state, that state has been state-centric, it has been militaristic, and it has veered between periods underpinned by being an absolute monarchy, but with spikes of despotic sort of authoritarianism. And that reflects in part the experience of more than 200 years of subjugation and domination under the Mongolian Tatar yoke, which for some people denied Russia that opportunity to experience the European Renaissance. But it did more than that. It really brought into the mindset and the structure of the evolving state that arose from that a sense of a deeply hierarchical, centrally controlled entity. And those elements remain very prominent in contemporary Russia. There's a couple of slides here that I'd like to be able to show you because they have images that illustrate some of this. And we'll just see whether we can manage to make this work. Hello, have we got a... That's all right. This is where I should have my previously prepared light-hearted anecdotes. But it's... Well, there's always things to amuse yourself about in relation to this part of the world. We are in a rather challenging phase with a war that is underway in Ukraine that is wreaking devastation and havoc, and I'll risk sort of skipping ahead a little bit by offering a view that I hope will come in the Q&A, the conversation and discussion about some of the contested and contestable theses about why we are where we are. And there is a strong view that NATO expansion is the root cause. While I believe in freedom of speech, I want to ban the phrase NATO expansion. That's a Kremlin term of art, and it suggests that the countries of Eastern Europe that had been liberated from 5 decades of domination by Moscow had no right to exercise sovereign choice and determine their own future. And they were countries that were expressly acknowledged that right by Vladimir Putin on several occasions, when he dismissed as insignificant to Russian interests the prospect of the Baltic states joining NATO, the prospects of Hungary joining NATO, of Slovenia, of Slovakia, and of Poland. So while there is not, I think, a blemish-free ledger on either side, I would encourage people to be cautious about taking into your mouths words like NATO expansion, and I'll come in a moment to the question of what is called nowadays foreign information manipulation and interference, FIMI, much better than counter disinformation. But this is an environment in which the Kremlin is well versed and well practiced. And it is an environment where I think even here in distant Australia, we face serious challenges because Russia, more so than China, in my view, is adroit at working with the grain of our societies. It understands us far better than we understand Russia. Even so, it's capable of making great errors of judgment and miscalculation, as we saw in the original assessments that led Vladimir Putin to think Ukraine would be a walkover within 4 or 5 days. But they understand how to amplify the natural dissonance and fractiousness which is inherent in democracy and which ultimately gives democracy its legitimacy. It's that contestation and that process of working through the competing worldviews that brings us to outcomes that people can sign on to and accept. And for Russia, unlike China, which seeks to displace the United States within the global rules-based order, the idea of sowing uncertainty and instability amongst adversary nations is central to its statecraft. And that is something I think we need to comprehend in this country much more. And people say to me often, why would Russia target us? Well, they've been targeting us for decades. The Soviet Union put a lot of espionage effort into Australia because of our alliance relationship with the United States. We are part of an essentially adversarially disposed camp, at least in the eyes of Moscow. And we are also a test bed for practices that will be employed, that have been employed, and may yet prove fruitful to Russia's broader agenda. And it's something that I still struggle with, and I might come to this in a moment under the second theme of spiritualism. I struggle still with the idea of why Russia perceives its security in the instability of other countries, not on its immediate periphery, because that is existentially challenging for Russia, and that is why Putin seeks to restore a sphere of influence. And that is where I think there is a disquieting meeting of minds with the Trump administration. And we are seeing elements of what I would call great power collusion rather than great power competition in this regard. And this is something that should trouble us. People also ask me, why does Russia matter to Australia? And it matters directly and indirectly, but it matters to us in part because it matters to countries that matter to us. It matters to China. It matters to India. It matters to the United States. It matters to Korea. It matters to Japan. And so we cannot be indifferent to those commonalities of strategic interest. I can press on while we're doing this. Well, I always know when I ran the IT branch in DFAT, the first recourse was power cycling, which was a highly remunerated technical term for switch it off and switch it back on again. But perhaps we'll do that and see where we go. While that is happening, I will touch briefly on what I think is another element, and that is what I've called spiritualism, for want of a better term. Now, for a lot of us who have grown up outside this sort of environment, it's difficult to comprehend just how deeply ingrained that sense of fate and predestination, but also the duality of the state and the centrality of the Russian Orthodox Church still is, and the resonance it has for contemporary Russia. All students of Russian eventually learn a piece of poetry by Fyodor Tyutchev, which is poorly rendered into English as "Russia cannot be fathomed with the mind. She knows no measurable bounds. She possesses a singular quality. One can only believe in Russia." And there is this underpinning sense that ultimately destiny, faith, and blind conviction. So in Russian, умом Россию не понять, аршином общим не измерить. У нее особенная стать, в Россию можно только верить. You can only believe in Russia. In 1832, under the reactionary Tsar Nicholas I, that sentiment partly was given a manifestation in the official policy of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Православие, самодержавие и народность. And that really still remains the three pillars upon which Putin's Russia is based. The Orthodox Church as an almost monopolistic representative of spiritual life in Russia, supporting the state, morally legitimizing the state's actions, and being enabled and having its primacy defended and protected by the state. Autocracy, of course, going back to that first concept of authoritarianism, where a single ruler proposes and disposes. And the word nationality doesn't quite capture the Russian Narodnost, which is a little bit more akin to the German Das Volk, the idea that there is some spiritual sense of cultural identification that binds people. And we'll see this again later when I talk about the Russian concept of the Russian world, which extends beyond what it says in your passport. The other element that is particularly prominent in my view throughout Russian history is this sense of exceptionalism. Russia is just different. Russia has been singled out by destiny, by providence. It is the bulwark of civilization, the repository of superior values. It is the third Rome. So with the great schism of the Eastern Orthodox Church, here we go. Hooray. Well done, Deb.
All right. Which slide should we be on?
Oh, well, that's good. So I've touched on those 4 points.
We'll be doing it manually.
You'll be doing it manually? Very good.
Yes.
So I've touched on those 4 points. I take some pride in this photo that I took. I used to drive past the Kremlin every day on my way to work. Next slide, please, Deb.
Yep.
So again, I've referenced this, that we have this deeply hierarchical, power-centric, authoritarian, centralized sort of system of government. Slide. Now, it's worth reflecting on this. This is a slightly simplified account of Russian history. If you look at the time chart roughly in century blocks, but you can see, starting with the consolidation in the dark green around Muscovy, how significant territorial expansion has been in the history of Russia and in the self-identification that still informs Russia's view of its place as a great power. And you can see how relatively recent some of those territorial acquisitions have been in the yellow fields. If we go to the next slide, that breaks it down a little bit more expressly and in a little more detail. So after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022, there is a story that an oligarch ran into Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and was just gobsmacked. How could this happen? Who was advising the president? It was done with such secrecy. It took so many people by surprise. Who was advising the president? He asked Lavrov. And Lavrov is reputed to have quipped in reply, the president has three advisors, Ivan the Great, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. And Ivan the Great, of course, or Ivan the Terrible, as we know him, Ivan Grozny, was responsible for the suppression and subjugation of the Tatar Khanate and the acquisition of vast tracts of territory in Siberia. Peter the Great was responsible for less territorial acquisition, but strategically it was far more significant. He wrested from the kingdom of the Swedes the areas of now the Baltic states and, of course, created a new capital in St. Petersburg, opening a window for Russia to the Baltic and to the West. And particularly pertinent to the contemporaneous challenges we see in Ukraine, Catherine the Great was responsible for the subjugation both of the Caucasus, but also large parts and the foundation of Odessa, of course, which we see in the news repeatedly. So I think there's some relevance in that, whether it's true or not. If you think from the historian autodidact's perspective of Putin, this was the high watermark of Russian imperial glory. Slide. You're doing well. The guy in the sort of banana splits headgear there is Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church, long reputed to have been an active member of the KGB, certainly with Putin, forms what in the military in Australia, in the Defence Force, we would call the diarchy, the secretary and the chief of the Defence Force, who in a way share control and authority. There's only one real leader, but certainly, as I said, the Orthodox Church has repeatedly spoken up in support of Russia's foreign policy adventurism. The bombing of Aleppo in Syria, for example, was legitimized by Kirill as part of the sacred duty of Russia to defend Orthodox Christians wherever they may be. You defend them by bombing the crap out of other people. That statue of Grand Prince Vladimir of Kiev was unveiled in Moscow in 2016, not long after I arrived. It wasn't in my honor. And then I knew it was significant, but I couldn't foretell what it portended. But it's a massive statue outside the Boroditsky gates of the Kremlin at the foot of the Manege Square. It's a very central part of Moscow. And it's telling that that figure who brought Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, to Russia in 988 as part of the consolidation, the political consolidation of the competing principalities and duchies that started to see the gravitation of authority towards Moscow from Kiev, the wellspring of Russian spiritual identity. Slide, thanks. I've talked about exceptionalism. There are three elements I'll come to now, but the key thing is this notion that Russia is singled out for a unique status and role. And we hear this repeatedly with Putin. The common cause he seeks to make across geographies as the bulwark of traditional values, of family values. He talks about the dukhovные skrepi, the sort of the moral ties that bind. And there is a calculated appeal there across the spectrum to right-wing, nationalist, conservative political sentiment across the globe. We are like you. We stand for these traditional conservative values. And before we move on, some might wonder why I used that slide to illustrate exceptionalism. One of the problems, we face two problems in our culture, one of self-deterrence, by thinking that things which deter us deter other people, and we're not up to the task. The other is we think everybody reacts in the same way to the same stimuli. I took this photo. I was traveling by car in the Volga River region. I was about 150 kilometres in either direction from the major sort of population points. This was in January 2018. It was minus 24 outside, plus wind chill. And coming towards us, I managed to get this photo. It's minus 24 plus wind chill. What are you going to do? We'll take the bike out for a spin. And without being sort of Marxist about it, if you live in an environment where you're agricultural season is 3 months of the year, where you're snowbound or subject to climatic constraints you have a different frame of reference. And therefore, when somebody says you're now sanctioned, you can't travel to Venice, they go, meh, who cares? Keep that in mind. Here is a different yardstick, and it's not because Russians love suffering, but they are conditioned differently to us. And I remember during COVID, when I had to wave my phone in the direction of a QR code at the Sapphire Mall in Bega and pretend I was checking in, I really got the shits because that was such an intrusion on my liberties. Pretty minor compared to some of the lived experience in this country. Slide, please. The concept of держава, which is a cognate of the Russian verb держать, which means to hold, implicitly after an act of seizing. We would hear this in the Cold War era, Великая держава, the great power, the superpower. And of course, on the right are the images of how Moscow would have you perceive Russia. Martial, forceful. That backdrop in the top slide on the right, the city of Moscow, as it were, like the city of London, that didn't exist when I last visited Moscow in 2004, privately on leave. When I went back in 2016 as ambassador, that had been created in the interim. But there is a lived reality, which we see in the slide on the left, where the sign over the entry to the building says, "Мы часть Великой России," we are part of Great Russia. So there is this dichotomy between the self-perception and the reality, and we need to bear that in mind without passing moral judgment or feeling superior, but there is this vast spectrum of lived reality. If we go to the next slide, the other point that really is worth bearing in mind, and I commend to you the book by Gregory Carlton, professor from Princeton University, Russia, the Story of War. It's not a big book, but it's an excellent book. It is the best account I think you can read of why war features so significantly in Russia's self-perception and self-awareness. And those quotes from that book, particularly the last one, I think underscores what I was saying earlier. There is a sense of Russia's unique place, the uniqueness of Russia's suffering, the scale of the losses it has experienced in the course of wars, but also as a result of self-inflicted wounds. And this comes back to my earlier point about that which deters us does not necessarily deter others. We marvel at why Russia doesn't rise up and overthrow Putin because of the losses in Ukraine. Let me give you one set of statistics to underscore why that shouldn't surprise us. So in the Yeltsin decade, when the Soviet archives were available, historians from around the world, including Mark Edele, the Hansen Chair of History at the University of Melbourne, were able to compile from Soviet archival documented records fairly accurate accounts of the losses that the Soviet population had experienced. And Mark has assessed that in what he calls the catastrophic years of Soviet history, from the beginning of the First World War in 1914, followed, of course, by the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, 4 years of civil war, famine, then, of course, collectivization and industrialization, the Second World War. So between 1914 and Stalin's death in 1953, based on Soviet archives, excess deaths beyond natural birth and death rates amounted to 55 million people in not quite 40 years. And importantly, the 27 million who perished in what Russia calls the Great Patriotic War, compared to the losses recorded between the census of 1926 and the census of 1939, 10 million people. Importantly, death came at the hands of the state. So state-sanctioned executions between 1921, when the Soviet Union at the end of the Civil War was formally promulgated, and 1953, the death of Stalin. These are Soviet archival records, just under 800,000 people. And in a little over 1 year, at the height of Stalin's Great Terror, the purges of 1937-38 directed against the party, against society, against the trade unions. Of those 800,000 state executions, not quite 682,000 executions were carried out in 12 to 17 months. we can't comprehend those sorts of figures. And it's not to say, as I said before, that Russians love suffering. I have no Russian friends who like suffering any more than I do. They like good food, they like good wine, they like comfortable homes. But if that's your frame of reference, you have a different perspective to that, which might shape how we perceive things. Slide, please. A recurrent theme is captured in this quote, which historians dispute, or at least are not in agreement about whether Tsar Alexander III ever said this to his son, the future Nicholas II, but it was good enough for Putin to quote it. And it underscores this perception that Russia is beleaguered. And unlike our cultures, where alliances are based on common history, common language, common values, common principles, common objectives and interests, Russia, and I put it to you like China, does not have a sense of alliances. There is no equivalent of the Five Eyes network of which Russia is a part. Australia, UK, United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, we share, we collaborate. And of course, for the Russian speakers here, Anna Mikhailova, of course, from the University of Queensland, like French and German, Russian has the formal and the familiar mode of address. Vous, tu, sie, du, in Russian, vous and tu. And when a Russian invites you to use the familiar mode of address, you've crossed a significant threshold. You are brought into the intimacy, and my Russian friends are the greatest and most loyal friends I would count upon anywhere in the world. And that's not pathos and saccharine sentiment, it's just true. Russians don't abandon friends. And the joke when somebody says to you in Russian, let's be friends, the response is great. Against whom? So Russia only has two allies. And slide, please. To reinforce that, this is not just some Anglophone Westerner who's telling you this. Sergei Yolkin, a very clever cartoonist who no longer lives or publishes in Russia, you'd be surprised, had this sort of take on the Putin-esque perception of Russia's place in the world, surrounded by enemies. And I particularly like the image on the right, this dark, sort of threatening, unknown out there, and the joyful, colourful sort of Rodina, the motherland, where everything's happy. So this sense of menace. Again, it's an illustration and a caricature, but it tells us something. Slide, please. I won't dwell on this, but we know what Putin said 20 years ago. And if you just look at that suite of dates from the 20th century, if you lived in the Soviet Union, if you lived in Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union and then post-Soviet Russia, you could draw a line from the short victorious war against Japan in 1905, which didn't end really well if you were a member of the Imperial Russian Navy and you were sunk in the Battle of Tsushima. World War I, the abdication of the Tsar in February 1917, the overthrow of the provisional government by the Bolshevik coup in October of that year, 4 years of civil war, collectivization and industrialization which ravage agriculture, the countryside, the forced urbanization of the economy and the population, the Great Terror of 37, 38, the Second World War, and then the East Berlin workers' uprising of 53, suppressed with the help of Soviet military forces. Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia in 68. When I arrived in Moscow in March 89, within a month and a half, we were seeing TV coverage of mass demonstrations in Leipzig and Dresden, and Gorbachev, the man who did not destroy the Soviet Union, that was Boris Yeltsin. Gorbachev said, we're not going to interfere. And then we saw the collapse of the USSR. And from Moscow's perspective, color revolutions in Georgia, in Kyrgyzstan, in Ukraine, in the Baltics. Then, of course, the Arab Spring and the shaking, confronting images of Gaddafi being pulled out of the culvert and then appearing dead, the overthrow of Mubarak in Egypt. These are things that, in the Kremlin's mind, speak to a concerted effort by enemies to bring down authoritarian governments. Slide, please. Oh, sorry, 2011 and 12, of course, was when the manifest rigging of the elections that saw Medvedev as president swapped back to Putin, because he abided by the constitution and only served 2 terms and then handed over to Medvedev, who started to look a little too comfortable in the role of president. And Putin said, I'm taking that back. And that was leveraged by Navalny and oppositionist figures, and that brought hundreds of thousands of people legitimately, organically out onto the streets in Moscow and elsewhere in protest at that, what the Russian calls castling maneuver, as in chess, where you simply swap pieces. Slide, please. So what does Russia want? I won't ask you to guess who's quoted, because I had a humility triple bypass. That's me. Against us, you cannot prevail. Without us, you cannot succeed. And sometimes when a minister says to you, what's the essence of Russia's foreign policy, you need that sort of two-floor elevator quip to be able to get it across. The idea I see in there is Russia is indefatigable, but woe betide anybody who fails to take account of Russia's legitimate interests, because we will mess with you and we will deny you the realization of your objectives. Think about how that might be reflected in what we've been seeing over the last few years. It's always been about parity with the United States. It's the only yardstick that mattered to the Soviet Union and that still matters to the Kremlin. But now I think Putin is moving beyond that and genuinely sees the US, particularly under Trump 2.0, at the head of a fundamentally decadent, in terminal decline Western civilization. It's personal for Putin, and that's for a variety of reasons. Slide, please. Again, when we sometimes wonder what do autocrats want, listen to what they say. In 2007, Putin was pretty clear at the Munich Security Conference in calling out US dominance and what he considered a unipolar world. And multipolarity is really where we find ourselves now. It is what is being actively prosecuted by Beijing, by Moscow. Look at BRICS. Look at the expansion of the BRICS to include countries in our own immediate region. Indonesia joined formally in January this year. Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam are aspirant members. This is about creating contested parallel structures to the post-World War II structures that have been dominated by the US. Slide, please. And again, I think a Russian cartoon is the best illustration of this concept of the privileged sphere of influence. And just 2 years ago, Putin invoked the memory of the Yalta and the Potsdam conferences, where the Allies met to carve up not just post-war Germany, but Europe and the world order. So this is very much in Putin's mind. And this idea of, you're our first Russian neighbours, I just find sweet. Slide, please, Dave. So it's personal for Putin. It might seem simplistic, but Ivan III, who was the first Tsar who began the consolidation of the duchies and principalities under Moscow's authority, the gatherer of the lands, Putin feels Russia was sold a pup. The Soviet Union was gunned down by the West. It's about respecting Russia's place in the world. And he's 72, and he is deeply concerned about where he will fit in the pantheon of his predecessors. So let's leap on now, thanks, Deb, to some of the warnings and lessons that come out of Ukraine. And the first is Putin's word is utterly worthless. And we might, with all due respect to the Honourable Paul Lucas, sort of question how much integrity we would invest in our own political leaders, but our system is based on accountability, and that is something that is manifestly absent in a system like Putin's Russia. The Russian world, I'll come to, the challenge we confront in Russian active measures and information operations, which in the next point I encapsulate in two old-fashioned words which are current again: subversion and sabotage. And ultimately, weakness is provocative. And by self-deterring, by wondering whether we ought to step up to Russia, we enable the aggressive neo-imperialist policies of Russia. And there's an exceptionally good book written by a prominent UK analyst, Keir Giles, published last year, called Who Will Defend Europe? I wrote a review of it, published in the Fin Review on January 31st. The book is excellent. My review is an absolute page-turner. It's actually only one page, so not too many to turn. But his thesis is that self-imposed policy constraints in Europe, notwithstanding the evidence of Russian support for separatist civil war in Donbass from 2007, the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, by the imposition of its own policies, NATO and Europe lacked political resolve and the military-industrial preparedness to deal with a revanchist Russia, which is why it was a semi-standing start in February 2022. But Europe is recovering, and again, quite recently, at this year's St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, Putin again recalled what he called the pricha, the saying, the sort of, wherever a Russian soldier sets foot, to это наше, that's ours. You don't just say that for effect. Slide, please. The reason his word is worthless, and I don't know how legible this is, but the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which was brought into being at the United States' behest, this was Senator Nunn and Senator Lugar, who saw a risk of nuclear proliferation in the presence of Soviet-era legacy nuclear weapons on Ukrainian soil after the Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine never had operational control over those weapons, but the fact that there was fissile material deployed across multiple areas was of concern. So 4 countries were signatories, 3 were guarantors, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Russia, reaffirm their commitment to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine, their obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force, and indeed, in the next paragraph, economic coercion in any way to undermine Ukrainian sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. So much for the Kremlin's assurances, past and future. No, it's not a treaty, but that language is pretty clear in English, Russian, and Ukrainian. Slide, please. The other thing that I think we need to keep in mind is Putin's repeated invocation of this concept of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, something which manifests, if you think back to that earlier slide where I referenced orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, and I said narodnost in Russian doesn't really render as nationality because that's what it says in your passport. The Ruski Mir, in Putin's own words, reaches beyond merely the label in your passport. It's how you feel and how the Kremlin perceives your belonging. If you're Russian, if you speak Russian, if you're Slavic, if you're Orthodox, you're part of the Russian world. And that gives Moscow not only a right, but an obligation to intervene. Slide, please. Russia is particularly prominent and active across what we might call hybrid warfare. And that is the exploitation of vulnerabilities and the use of actions below the threshold of armed conflict to subvert and suborn independence and sovereignty. My absent colleague Matt Sussex has written on this. Importantly, information warfare is as significant in the Russian military strategic doctrine as kinetic warfare, as military action. It's about achieving strategic surprise, and it's adaptive. It exploits those interstices between rules. It exploits grey zones where the rules are not clear. And as I was saying earlier, it harnesses the contestability that's inherent in democracy. And it seeks to make people doubt the intent and integrity of our own governments because it's sufficient for the Kremlin's purpose to have France and Germany, Europe, Australia, Canada, wrestling with itself about what is the right course of action. And we've seen that with the well-documented research into interference and attempts to manipulate and exploit electoral processes. And we are a target because we are a hostile nation in the Kremlin's eyes. We support Ukraine. That makes us an enemy, perhaps not so much in the sense of a country that is directly engaged in military conflict against Russian interests, but we're enabling that, and therefore we are suspect. Slide, please. Really important is in the saturated world of these things, there is credible and ample research done by Harvard and the European Union into how Russia has been flooding cyberspace, and exploiting the volume-centered search algorithms of some of the leading chatbots, including Grok, Copilot, ChatGPT, such that roughly 1/3 of the material that is out there is sourced from Kremlin-backed origins. And when these search engines and chatbots go looking for material, they're drawing on a source supply that is fully 1/3 Kremlin originated. And as that last point shows, last year alone, there were 3.6 million articles that have been identifiably embedded in Western AI systems, and LLM, large language model grooming, is designed to manipulate, and so this becomes self-replicating. And it reinforces, as we know with social and other media, you search for the things that reinforce your views, and this feeds off itself. Slide. They, of course, also use other agents and proxies, and I don't intend to talk at great length to this, but certainly Global Research, which is a Canada-centred information source, has been shown conclusively by Harvard to be strongly informed and shaped by Kremlin dis and misinformation. You'd be familiar here in Brisbane with the allegations around the Korolyovs, who were allegedly seeking to share military sensitive information with Russia for reasons that would be obvious. I don't want to be sued for slander. Let's just say there's a sufficiently large cohort of useful idiots, to use the Lenin term, in our country as well as elsewhere, who mindlessly regurgitate this stuff and are only too willing, either out of conviction or out of naivety, to replicate sort of Kremlin propaganda. Slide, please. But a lot of this isn't new, because if you go back to 2014 and pay attention to those images, suspicious blasts in the Czech Republic, work done by Bellingcat, Czech Republic expelling diplomats, Alexander Mishkin and Anatoly Chipiga, who are, I think, very, very creditably identified as members of Russian Military Intelligence Unit 29155. They come up again in a little while. These are examples of what Russia has been doing for a decade already in terms of sabotage and going after dissent and opposition. Slide, please. Not long after that, there was this raid on Sakaryoto Island, Finland. There were suspicions about what the Russian-backed infrastructure development there was intended to achieve. Again, you could contest this, you could debate it, but you look at the undersea sabotage that's been occurring in the Baltic Sea, of gas pipelines, of telecommunications cables. If you look at China's mapping of cables in our own region, this is a front in the emerging heightened tension and conflict scenarios of which we should be aware. Slide. And again, instances of active sabotage. Then people would dispute how much of this can be definitively attributed to Moscow, but I think there is a pattern of smoke and fire. We can talk about that. Slide. Chipiga and Mishkin, of course, are famous as the people who decided to go to Salisbury because the Salisbury Cathedral was such a prominent landmark and it was a must-see tourist destination, and it was nearly coincidental that Sergei Skripal and his daughter very nearly succumbed to a Novichok poison. And of course, as Russia today would have you believe, these poor people who are only involved in the fitness industry are now have had their lives turned upside down because they're suspected of being the chief poisoners in the case of the Skripals and in other instances that we saw earlier in the Czech Republic. So cruising to the finish line, so what, now what? It's a long game. Our political culture predisposes us to want to resolve things. I put it to you that we need to, looking at the audience here, and many people wouldn't know necessarily what I mean by the Sullivans, but we need to recapture our Sullivan's moment. TV series in Australia about a Melbourne middle-class family in the Second World War that just had to keep on buggering on, not knowing what was going to happen next, not knowing when it was going to end, how it was going to end. We need to develop a resilience and a resolve that, frankly, when I reflect upon my 35 years in the public service, I grew up in an Australia that was pretty complacent. So leaving aside the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the 9/11 attacks a decade later that began the 20-year so-called global war on terror, we've had it pretty good. And globalization has brought us nothing but benefits. And suddenly we now have to recognize that this is a long game and it's not going to be solved in this electoral cycle or next electoral cycle. Importantly, one of the chief disruptors of the post-World War II international security order is an architect and a guarantor of that system, Russia, permanent member of the UN Security Council, along with China. China seeks to recraft the system from within to displace the United States. Russia seeks to disrupt the system because the system will conspire against it. People have talked about the axis of upheaval, or CRINK, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Trump 2.0, new age of empires, vulnerabilities in areas where the rules of the road are not yet written, but these are also areas upon which we depend. Every single day, every minute of the day, there is a cyber war being waged every minute of every day, as we are seeing and hearing repeatedly in the media. Disinformation and disharmony, I've touched upon that. It's really important we reinvest in Russia literacy. I went to the University of Queensland when there was a department of Russian. There were 40 of us in first year Russian. There was a department of German. Russian had been relegated a few years ago to the status of a minor in the university. Work is underway to reverse that. That's really important. We have one university in Australia that still delivers anything resembling a degree course based on Russian literacy and Russian language and Russian studies. That's not good enough in an environment where Russia and China are colluding. I'll come back to Yavlinsky's 3 points. Slide, please. A lot is made of the No Limits friendship, and I'm conscious of time, but I hope you'll indulge me because we had a slightly disrupted start. But they've now met 45 times. This is not a relationship that we would consider an alliance. It's based on convergent strategic interests defined in oppositional US terms, opposing US preponderance. But there is no fundamental trust, and we know that Chinese military are directed to use Chinese names for the territories, including the city of Vladivostok, that were wrested from China in the unequal treaty of Aigun and Peking in the 1860s. Give them time. Give them time. We'll get it back. Slide. There is a different alignment now. It's not great power competition anymore. It's great power collusion. And what we're seeing, perhaps, the slow evolution in the Trump administration's realization that Putin is playing Trump for a chump. And the best card, if you're in the business of saying you have or don't have cards, the best card I think we could have is Putin's propensity to overreach. Whether the shift in rhetoric out of the White House marks a sustained shift in policy, we are yet to see. But I hope at the very least we won't impede Ukraine in its efforts to continue to defend its own sovereignty so long as Ukrainians are willing to fight and die for it. Slide. And remembering too that from Putin's point of view, this is being classed as an existential battle. And the reference to historical borders and the notion that this is a challenge to the very integrity and existence of the Russian state is part of his framing and phrasing. Slide. But just so we don't dwell in too maudlin an environment, I like this not Sputnik sort of spoof. If you keep banging on about historical borders, somebody might start to take you at your word, and that doesn't necessarily play out to Moscow's advantage. Slide. And of course, other people have their own perceptions of what might constitute historical borders. And while we may be tempted to succumb to the Kremlin's propaganda, slide, we shouldn't assume that Putin is this sort of omnipotent 10-foot tall super spy, the man with the golden gun, slide, or indeed Ant Stavro Blofeld, no matter what similarities you might sort of perceive. So to end, that poster from the Soviet era, the whole world will be ours. If you think I'm obsessing too much, look where that fat little bastard's hand is located on the map of the world. We have reason to think Russia is relevant to us. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Peter. That was excellent. We've got a few minutes left, so I'll try and get a few questions from the audience before we wrap up, noting that we did have some technical difficulties there. So does anyone have a question for Peter? Yes.
Was there ever a point very early on when Putin came to power that there was ever a chance to change what has happened? That we could have been persuaded otherwise? Would there have been some sort of even Marshall Plan organised, or might just have your answer for that one?
Yeah, so the question, in case it's not audible for the online folk, is was there a point where it might have been possible to direct this down a different pathway that Putin would have been amenable? I think in the early years, yes. I think he sought, without really comprehending, a way, a sort of a modus vivendi with the West. But unfortunately, the terms for that were still too embryonic, and it's hard to say what would have been enough. So there was talk about Russia joining NATO. They created the NATO-Russia Council. A few years after that, the then Secretary General of NATO visited Moscow and said, I want to develop closer relations between NATO and Russia, and Putin said, I'm not interested in closer relations with NATO. I want to see NATO abolished. So I think there was, even in the early years, and I think characterising Putin's perception was, of course, his early encounter with the oligarch-dominated free media in Russia, which suddenly, if you recall the sinking of the Kursk, the Russian submarine in the Baltic, he was confronted by angry families in real time on live television and was asked what happened to the Kursk, and he said it sank, and he was pilloried. And I think that set him down a pathway of repressive centralisation of control, which of course immediately got the backs of the West up. And I think we were very quickly embarked upon this is not how countries behave that we want to see embraced. I often ask others, would we be in a better position if Russia had become a member of NATO? What would have happened then to Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, the Baltics who wanted to join NATO? Would that have happened? I mean, it's hard to know. But ultimately, I come back to a simple fact. The borders of 1991 were the borders. And Putin has chosen to use military force to attempt to rewrite, whatever the motives. That's not how international relations are prosecuted.
So is that a mistake on Yeltsin's part to allow someone with this background to make Putin himself maneuver into that scenario?
We don't really know quite why they seized upon Putin, other than I think there was a concern that we needed to be confident that somebody would honour the deal and that Yeltsin and the family's interests would be protected, and Putin has honoured that deal. So I think it was the idea that this was a guy who we could perhaps manage, but it didn't quite work out that way. And it's not because he's a super spy. He's just a very clever, tactically driven and capable individual. And remember, his posting as a KGB officer was as a lieutenant colonel in Dresden, in the GDR. It's about the safest place in the Warsaw Pact you could be posted. He wasn't recruiting the next Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. He was an administrator in a country which had more uniformed official and unofficial informants and spies per capita than the Soviet Union had. So, again, as those last slides show, he's not Blofeld or the man with the golden gun.
Oh, but do you see
So what does a post-Putin world look like? It's really hard to say. He has presided over the hollowing out of the institutions that even in the Soviet era gave checks and balances to the system. The trade unions, the courts, even in the Soviet era, the courts would dispense justice in matters like housing and workers' rights and wages. If you went anywhere near national security, forget it, you were gone for all time. but he's hollowed out the army. The party doesn't exist. He's hollowed out the courts, the trade unions. And so he's presided as the capo di tutti e capi, the boss of all bosses, over a system which stands on three pillars: the business oligarchy, the technocracy which runs the country, and the securitocracy, the sileriki, as they're called, people who come from the intelligence community and the security background. And no individual, apart from Putin himself, is allowed to straddle those three pillars with any degree of control and influence. You can be rich, but you can't run the government. You can be the prime minister and you'll make money on the side, but you're not going to become a multi-billionaire like the Rotenbergs or the Vekselbergs or others. The problem, of course, is what happens when Putin dies. Or perhaps more telling problem is what happens if Zelensky dies suddenly. But I think if Putin dies, and he will die in office, I have a slide I sometimes use which lists not every leader of Slavic Russia, of Imperial Russia, and of post-Imperial Soviet Russia, but I highlight 4 names there, and I often ask people, why are those 4 names highlighted? And they say, oh, they were reformers or whatever. No, there were only 4 people up till Putin who died in the top job in office, who left the top job. Everybody else died in office of causes natural or unnatural. Nicholas II abdicated and was murdered. Nikita Khrushchev was removed by the party because he was erratic, unpredictable, too reformist. Mikhail Gorbachev ran out of country to run, and Boris Yeltsin handed over to Putin. Every other leader of the Soviet Union and Russia has died in the top job. So as long as Putin keeps up the judo and the Botox, he'll be with us for a while. And when he dies, it'll be like that scene in Death of Stalin. There'll be this jockeying because I don't trust you, but I trust him even less. So let's be friends. Great. Against whom? And so but the system is so invested in the perpetuation of that system. And there is no liberal alternative government in waiting. They're dead, in jail, or in exile. But we need somehow to find it in ourselves to consider, what does a decade or 25 years hence look like? Russia is unavoidable. It's inescapable. It's a country with so much to give. And I'm not sure quite how we chart that course and how we keep that alive in our own minds without sounding naive. But there has to be a post-Russia, a post-Putin Russia. It's very difficult to articulate what that looks like now.
I have a question from one of our online attendees. How do you see the Russia-China relationship play out in the future? And can 2 expansionist powers peacefully share a long common border?
Well, it was under Putin, of course, that they finally demarcated that border. And it is a very large common border. And I remember in Yekaterinburg talking with the former mayor of that city, who was a sort of an independently elected man. That only ever happened once, and then the United Russia Party decided they didn't like that idea. I was asking him on a visit, I hear a lot about Spain and France and Germany and Britain. I don't hear the C word. What's China up to? And he said, well, I've led a lot of business delegations to China and they're very professional. But he said at the end of every conversation, there are 2 words: les y miedь, timber and copper. And there is this perception that China will bide its time, but it's about what it can extract. So there is a deep underlying lack of trust. But at the official level, there is a strong convergence, as I was saying, of political and strategic interest. And I don't think China feels a need to act. But of course, as that asymmetry grows economically, as China increasingly enables Russia's war in Ukraine, I have a different slide that shows in 25 years the growth in China's market significance for Russian goods exports is enormous, from 5 to about 28%. The growth in Russia's market significance for Chinese exports has been flatlining over that 25 years. China doesn't invest in Russia unless it's in very specific areas, usually geographically proximate. So it's a bide your time, it will fall our way approach, I think, from Beijing. And there is not a lot of trust there at a simple level.
Can I develop that the economic question?
Yeah.
Russia is not the economy that it once was. So the petrochemicals, petroleum and oil and gas are very significant. And it's very expensive to fight wars, and it's very expensive to run a country like that. Tell us about the Russian economy and to what extent it will ultimately impose limits on their ability to do what they want to do.
Yes.
The country's depopulating. So tell us about that.
Well, in brief, because I'm not an economist, but I would direct you at anything that a woman by the name of Alexandra Prokopenko writes on the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace website. She's an ex-Russian central bank economist. This is not a near-term collapse, but with central bank interest rates at 21% and under pressure from the Kremlin just reduced a little bit, mortgage rates very high, unemployment low, wages high, the country is burning through capital. It's got long-term structural problems coming economically. They're not going to change immediate near-term Kremlin policies. There is going to be a problem if war ends tomorrow in Ukraine. A highly militarized economy is not going to suddenly revert to making washing machines. And the fact that it is still very centrally dependent on the price of oil and gas says that there is a weakness there, which is why it's been interesting that the European Union has enlarged sanctions on the shadow fleet of tankers that are transporting Russian oil. They've lowered the price cap. A lot will depend upon whether Donald Trump actually does impose secondary sanctions to pressure Russia. So I think I talked to our current ambassador in Moscow, and he was back recently, and he said, yeah, the restaurants are full in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Prices are higher. The roads are starting to show signs of wear. Infrastructure investment is being compromised because they need to keep paying money to people to sign up. They need to keep paying money to widows and orphans and so on. So I think the heavily hydrocarbon-centric Russian economy is still a vulnerability, depending on the global oil price and the extent to which countries are conniving to help circumvent sanctions. But I know from talking with a few folk, because of the slow phased imposition of sanctions, Russian businesses have had time to adapt. There's a guy running a machine tool making business in St. Petersburg who said to a friend of mine, actually, it was great when all the Western countries abandoned Russia, we could buy their brand new factories for a song. And suddenly we had this massive modernization of our own production capability that we could never otherwise have afforded to do. So there's two sides to that. But I think the hydrocarbon heavy focus of the economy is a vulnerability. And the fact that it's increasingly moved into a military industrial production platform and is struggling to get financial services, to get insurance, to get parts, other than through the connivance of China and India and others. It's not going to change the near term, but in 25 years' time, 20 years' time, I'd hate to be the central bank governor or the minister for the economy.